In the climate-controlled vault of the British Museum, beneath London's grey skies, sits a small carnelian and lapis lazuli bead, catalogue number 1929,017.146. It weighs perhaps 2 grams. You could lose it between the cushions of your couch. A curator once told a visiting researcher that when they first handled this particular bead during conservation work, they were struck by how ordinary it felt. Smooth, dense, unremarkable in the palm, just a small blue stone with gold caps recovered from a burial shaft at in southern Iraq, excavated by Leonard Woolley's team in the winter of 1927. But here's what that curator didn't mention, what the museum label doesn't say, what makes this tiny object impossible: that bead began its existence in a mountain cave in Afghanistan, over 1,200 miles away, across some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. The lapis lazuli it's made from comes from exactly one geological source in the ancient world: Badakhshan, remote valleys in the Hindu Kush, where stone meets sky at 14,000 feet. And somehow, 4,000 years ago, this stone made that journey, not once as an accident, but repeatedly, systematically, as part of a supply chain so reliable that Sumerian craftsmen could plan their work around it. The title of this video promises you the rarest commodities in Sumer, things worth more than gold. And if you're watching at night, trying to sleep, or in the quiet morning hours, or during a long commute from wherever you are in the world right now, leave a comment and tell me your location and what time it is. Because this story about distance, about things that travel impossible lengths, connects us across time just as those ancient materials connected worlds that weren't supposed to touch. This isn't a story about treasure, it's about dependency, about a civilization that couldn't exist without things it couldn't produce, and what the tablets recording those things might preserve. Not just lists of commodities, but memories of networks older than the cities themselves. Let's begin with the fundamental problem, the geography of absence. Stand in southern Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the place we call the cradle of civilization. Close your eyes and imagine building a city here around 3000 BCE. What do you need? Stone for foundations? There is none. The land is alluvial silt, river mud deposited over millennia. You can dig down 50 feet and find nothing but clay and sand. No bedrock, no granite, no limestone, no marble, no basalt. Timber for roofs, for beams, for boats, for siege engines, for furniture. There is none. A few date palms, some tamarisk bushes along the river. Nothing you could call a forest. Nothing that produces boards longer than a man is tall. Metal for tools, for weapons, for trade, for prestige. There is none. No copper deposits, no tin, no silver, no gold, no iron. The soil yields clay and reeds and barley. That's all. Precious stones for jewellery, for inlay, for divine statues, for cylinder seals that seal contracts. There are none. No turquoise, no carnelian, no agate, no lapis lazuli. The earth here gives you nothing that glitters. The Sumerian word for their land was Kiangir, the land of the lords. But the lords ruled over mud. Fertile mud, yes. Mud that could grow barley in quantities that fed cities. But mud nonetheless. Every single material required to advance beyond agricultural villages had to come from somewhere else. Not from the neighbouring valley, not from 20 miles away. From hundreds of miles away. From mountain ranges they couldn't see. From coastlines they had never visited, from peoples whose languages they didn't speak. This is the fact that sits at the foundation of Sumerian civilization, and which conventional archaeology treats as merely an interesting detail. Sumer had no choice but to trade. It had to establish and maintain supply lines across vast distances from its very inception, not after it became wealthy, not once it developed leisurely interest in luxury goods. From day one, from the moment someone decided to build a temple larger than a hut, they needed cedar beams from Lebanon. From the moment someone needed a copper blade sharper than a flint one, they needed ore from Oman or Anatolia or Iran. From the moment someone wanted to carve a cylinder seal to mark their property, they needed stone from distant quarries. Let's be specific about distances. We're not talking about convenient proximity. Lebanon, source of the cedar wood that appears in temple construction records throughout Sumerian history lies approximately 650 miles northwest of Ur. The journey required crossing the Syrian desert, one of the driest regions on Earth, or following a longer route along the Euphrates River Valley through territories controlled by other peoples. The copper sources in Oman, which the Sumerians knew as Magan, sit roughly 1,200 miles to the southeast, across the Persian Gulf. No sailing around familiar coastlines, open water, storms, pirates. The archaeological site of Maysar in Oman shows evidence of copper smelting dating to the 3rd millennium BC, with slag heaps and mining tools that match the material descriptions in Sumerian import tablets. Afghanistan, sole source of the lapis lazuli that appears in nearly every important Sumerian burial, royal workshop and temple treasury, lies over 5,100 miles to the northeast. The metamorphic structure of lapis lazuli is geologically distinctive. Analysis of every significant sample from Sumerian sites points to the Sai Sang mines in Badakhshan province. To get there from Ur, you cross the Zagros Mountains, traverse the Iranian Plateau, navigate passes that close in winter, and reach valleys where the air is thin enough to make breathing difficult. The Indus Valley Civilization, which Sumerian texts call Meluha, extends from 1,800 to 2,500 miles to the east. Carnelian beads recovered from Ur's royal cemetery show manufacturing techniques, specific drilling patterns, distinctive shapes, particular finishing methods, identical to those found at Harappan sites like Mohenjo-Daro and Chanudaro. These aren't similar, they're the same, which means either Indus Valley craftsmen travelled to Mesopotamia, or more likely their products moved through intermediate trading partners in a supply chain spanning half a continent. Now consider what this means logistically. A merchant damgar in Ur wants to commission a necklace for a temple dedication. He needs gold from northern Iran or Anatolia 800 plus, lapis lazuli beads from Afghanistan half 500 plus, carnelian beads from the Indus Valley 2000 plus, silver wire from Anatolia 900 plus. None of these materials exist in his homeland. Every component requires a separate supply chain. Each chain involves different intermediaries, different languages, different payment systems, different transport methods, riverboat, seagoing vessel, donkey caravan, human porter. Each faces different risks: desert raiders, mountain passes closed by snow, storms in the Gulf, political instability in transit regions. And yet the archaeological record shows this merchant could source all these materials reliably, repeatedly, in quantities sufficient to supply not just royal workshops, but private craftsmen across multiple cities. The abundance of lapis lazuli in even modest Sumerian burials suggests regular high-volume trade. These weren't rare caravans bringing exotic gifts once a generation. This was systematic commerce. The question mainstream archaeology asks is, how did the Sumerians develop such sophisticated trade networks? But there's another question, one that the tablets themselves seem to whisper. What if they didn't develop them? What if they inherited them? The earliest written tablets we have from Sumer, the proto-cuneiform texts from Uruk, dated to around 3300 BCE, already show accounting for exotic materials, not primitive attempts at record keeping, fully developed accounting. The symbols for lapis lazuli, for silver, for copper are present from the beginning. The administrative structures are in place. The weights and measures are standardized. The merchants already have a professional designation, damgar. It's as if someone turned on the lights and found the whole system already running. The environmental reality of Mesopotamia meant that civilization there could only exist as part of a larger network. Sumer could not be isolated, could not be self-sufficient, could not develop in a vacuum. Every step forward required materials from beyond the horizon, which means every step forward required knowledge of where those materials were, how to get them, how to transport them, what to trade for them, and crucially, that they existed at all. How does a civilization just emerging from the Neolithic know that 1,200 miles away, in mountains it's never seen, in a valley it's never visited, there exists a blue stone that can be carved and polished, and that its gods might desire. How does it know that 2,000 miles to the east there are people who make beads in a particular way that will complement that blue stone perfectly? The conventional answer is gradual discovery through expanding trade contacts. Merchant meets merchant, network connects to network. Over centuries knowledge spreads. But the tablets don't show gradual discovery. They show immediate awareness. The earliest administrative records treat these distant materials not as recent discoveries, but as established necessities. They have names, they have standard values, they have regular suppliers. The system is already mature. What if the Sumerians were restoring something rather than inventing it? What if the trade networks predated the cities? What if the knowledge of distant materials came from a time before writing, preserved through methods we're only beginning to glimpse, oral tradition, material culture, the memory embedded in the objects themselves? We'll explore these possibilities throughout this investigation. But first, we need to understand the system the Sumerians used to manage their dependency on distant materials. We need to understand silver as memory. Tablet YBC 4662, held in the Yale Babylonian collection, measures just 4 inches by 3 inches. Inscribed in clear cuneiform during the Ur III period, around 2100 BC, it records a transaction so ordinary that it's revelatory. A quantity of barley, 300 sila, roughly 300 litre, exchanged for 1 shekel of silver. This ratio appears again and again across thousands of administrative tablets from the Neo-Sumerian period. Not approximately, not roughly, exactly. 1 shekel equals 300 sila of barley. The consistency is remarkable. From Ur to Nippur to Lagash to Ummah, across different cities, different administrators, different years, the ratio holds. It's not market fluctuation. It's not supply and demand. It's a fixed standard, maintained with almost religious precision. Why does this matter? Because silver is not found in Mesopotamia. Every grain of silver in Sumer was imported from Anatolia, from Iran, from the Taurus Mountains, from sources hundreds of miles away, controlled by other peoples, subject to disruption, requiring constant trade missions to acquire. Silver was foreign, exotic, difficult to obtain, and yet somehow this foreign material became the universal measure of value for domestic agricultural products. Think about what that means. The Sumerians made their most abundant, most reliable, most essential commodity, the barley that fed their population, commensurable with one of their rarest, most imported, most exotic materials. They anchored their economy to something they couldn't produce. This wasn't a natural development. This was a choice, and it was a choice that required tremendous coordination. To maintain a fixed exchange rate between silver and barley across multiple city-states over centuries requires several things. First, central authority capable of enforcing the standard. Second, widespread acceptance of silver's value, which means silver had to be recognizable, testable, divisible, and desirable to everyone from temple administrators to travelling merchants. Third, reliable supply of both commodities. If barley harvests varied wildly, or silver imports became unpredictable, the fixed rate would collapse. The Sumerian shekel wasn't a coin. Coinage wouldn't be invented for another millennium and a half. It was a weight measure, approximately 8.33 grams of silver. Merchants carried small balance scales and sets of standardized stone weights. When you paid someone, you weighed out the silver in front of them. Payment wasn't anonymous. It was a witnessed, measured transaction. But here's where it becomes interesting. Silver fragments in the right weight denominations needed to be available. You couldn't always shave off exactly 1 shekel from a larger piece. So silver circulated in pre-cut pieces, rings, coils, scraps that approximated standard weights. This required silver workers, assayers, and a whole infrastructure around testing and certifying silver purity. The Sumerian word for silver is kababar, literally white metal or shining metal. Gold was kasig, yellow metal. But while gold appears frequently in luxury contexts, jewellery, divine statues, royal burials, it almost never appears as a standard of value in administrative texts. Silver was the money metal. Gold was prestigious, but not systematic. Why silver instead of gold? One possibility, silver was more abundant in the mountainous regions north and east of Mesopotamia, making it more practical for regular trade. But abundance is relative. Both metals had to be imported. Both required the same supply chain challenges. Yet silver became the measure and gold remained the ornament. Another possibility, silver's very foreignness made it ideal as a neutral standard. No single city-state controlled its production. No local authority could manipulate its supply the way they might manipulate barley stores. Silver came from beyond Sumerian borders, which paradoxically made it trustworthy as a universal measure within those borders. But there's a third possibility, one that the tablets hint at but never state explicitly. What if silver's role as a value standard wasn't a Sumerian innovation? What if they inherited it? Tablet BM 106438 from the British Museum, an old Akkadian administrative text from around 2300 BC, uses the silver barley exchange rate in exactly the same way the later UA3 texts do. Same ratio, same administrative vocabulary, same calculation methods. The system was already ancient when this tablet was inscribed. The precision suggests long establishment, not recent adoption. Even more intriguing, tablets from Ebla in Syria, dated to 2400-2350 BC, show similar use of silver as an accounting unit, though with different local ratios. The concept of silver as value standard wasn't unique to Sumer. It was regional. Multiple cultures, speaking different languages, separated by hundreds of miles, all independently decided silver would measure worth. Or did they all remember the same system? Silver has another property crucial for ancient commerce. It doesn't degrade. Gold doesn't tarnish. Lapis lazuli doesn't decay. Carnelian doesn't rot. These materials are effectively immortal. An ingot of silver from 3000 BC is chemically identical to silver mined yesterday. This permanence made these materials ideal for wealth preservation across generations. Unlike grain, livestock, or textiles which deteriorate, precious metals and stones could serve as multi-generational stores of value. Perhaps this is why they became trade goods in the first place. Not because they were beautiful, though they were. Not because they were rare, though they were. But because they remembered. A piece of lapis passed from hand to hand across 1,000 years still gleams blue. Silver hoarded by one generation can be melted and reused by the next. These materials are physical memory, carrying value forward through time. The Sumerians organized their entire economy around materials that lasted. The standard measures, silver, copper, grain, could all be stored. The luxury goods, lapis, gold, carnelian, were essentially eternal. The building materials, cedar beams, stone blocks, could outlast multiple human lifetimes. It's an economy built for continuity, for transmission, for inheritance. Administrative tablet Nick 2, 5 and 10 from the Nikolsky collection records the monthly silver allocation to a merchant named Lu Dingira. Month after month, year after year, during the reign of King Shulki, Lu Dingira received his silver ration, conducted his trades, and accounted for the results. The tablets documenting his career spanned decades. The system that employed him had existed for centuries before his birth, and would continue for centuries after his death. This is what the silver tablets preserve. Not wealth exactly, but continuity. Each tablet is a node in a network that extends across space and entering distant minds to Mesopotamian cities and time, past to present to future, through stable value measures. The silver didn't just buy commodities, it anchored memory. When a merchant in Ur calculated his profit on a textile shipment to Dilmun, when a temple administrator recorded the silver equivalent of barley rations, when a royal workshop listed the cost of lapis lazuli beads, they weren't just doing accounting, they were participating in a system of value that spanned the known world, a system so stable that its ratios stayed fixed across generations, a system so widespread that distant cities used the same measures, a system so ancient that even the earliest texts treat it as established fact. The tablets don't explain where this system came from, they simply record its operation. And in that silence, in that gap between the earliest writing and the already mature economy it describes, lies a question. What memories did the silver carry before anyone wrote them down? The Afghan mystery. The Sarisang mines in Badakhshan province, northeastern Afghanistan, sit at an elevation of 9,800 feet in the Hindu Kush mountains. The air is thin, winters are brutal. The nearest significant settlement is a day's journey on foot. The stone comes from contact metamorphic deposits, formed where limestone met ancient magma, creating veins of intensely blue rock, streaked with white calcite and flecked with gold pyrite. This specific geological signature, the particular combination of lazurite, pyrite, calcite and trace minerals, occurs nowhere else on Earth in comparable quality and quantity. Every significant piece of lapis lazuli found in Sumerian contexts originated here. Not probably, not likely, definitely. Mineralogical analysis using X-ray diffraction, scanning electron microscopy and chemical composition mapping can fingerprint the source of lapis samples with extraordinary precision. The metamorphic structure leaves a signature as distinctive as dinar. Samples from the royal cemetery at Ur, from the temple treasuries at Nippur, from private graves at Kish, all point to Badakhshan. The distance from Sarisang to Ur, if you could somehow draw a straight line through mountains, deserts and rivers, is approximately 1,500 miles. But merchants don't travel in straight lines. The actual routes followed terrain, water sources, established way stations, and political realities. The most plausible path took traders northeast from Ur to the Iranian plateau, through or around the Zagros Mountains, across the Dasht-i-Kavir Desert, skirting the southern edge of the Caspian region, then east through increasingly difficult terrain toward the Hindu Kush. Round trip, potentially 4,000 miles. Journey time, several months, perhaps 6 to 8 months, depending on season, route and delays. This wasn't a day trip, this was an expedition. Now consider what this implies. For lapis lazuli to appear reliably in Sumerian cities, and it does appear reliably, not sporadically, these expeditions had to succeed regularly. Caravans had to depart, traverse hostile territory, locate the mines themselves in remote valleys, negotiate with local populations for access, obtain the stone, and return, all while avoiding bandits, surviving weather, managing pack animals, feeding personnel, and navigating political boundaries. The risk factor was enormous. A caravan represented massive capital investment, donkeys or camels, personnel, guards, provisions for months of travel, trade goods valuable enough to exchange for lapis, gifts or bribes for local authorities along the route. And at journey's end, you're negotiating with people who control the only source of a material your entire civilization craves. They know you need it. They know you travelled 1,500 miles to get it. They can name their price. Yet the supply remains steady enough that even relatively modest Sumerian graves contain lapis lazuli beads. This wasn't royal monopoly. This wasn't rare tribute from conquered territories. This was commerce, repeated and reliable enough that middle-class Sumerians could afford at least small amounts. How? The conventional model suggests a series of intermediary traders. Sumerian merchants travelled to western Iran. Iranian traders brought goods from eastern Iran. Eastern Iranian contacts connected to Afghan sources. No single caravan made the full journey. The stone passed through multiple hands, each taking a markup until it finally reached Mesopotamia. This model solves the distance problem, but creates another question: coordination. For an intermediary trade network to function reliably across that distance, each segment needs to connect smoothly with the next. The Western Iranian trader needs to know that Eastern Iranian sources will have lapis available when he arrives. The Eastern Iranian trader needs reliable access to Afghan suppliers. Timing, quantities, quality standards, payment methods, all these have to align across linguistic, cultural, and political boundaries, and somehow they did, for centuries. Tablet YBC 1673 from the Yale Babylonian collection, dating to the Ur-3 period, records the receipt of lapis lazuli in standardized weight measures, not as rare treasure, as inventory. The bureaucratic language is the same used for copper, silver, or barley. It's routine, which means by 2100 BCE, lapis was arriving in Ur with enough regularity to require standardized accounting procedures. But the royal cemetery at Ur, excavated by Leonard Woolley between 1922 and 1934, dates to around 2600 BC, 500 years earlier. The graves contain spectacular quantities of lapis lazuli, necklaces with hundreds of beads, inlaid lyres, cylinder seals, statues with lapis eyes. Queen Puabi's headdress included elaborate goldwork interspersed with lapis lazuli ornaments, not small amounts, not occasional imports, industrial quantities, which means the supply chain was already mature, already reliable, already capable of delivering large volumes by 2600 BC. Push the timeline back, and you're into the early dynastic period, when writing itself was just beginning to record anything beyond simple accounts. Yet the lapis was already flowing. The earliest proto-cuneiform tablets from Uruk, circa 3300 BC, include the symbol for lapis lazuli, zajin. The symbol exists. The word exists. The material is known, valued, and important enough to require a written sign in humanity's first attempts at literacy. The Sumerians knew about Afghan lapis before they knew how to write more than basic pictograms. How did they know it existed? How did they know where to get it? There's a practical consideration that makes this even more puzzling. Lapis lazuli requires specific knowledge to work. It's relatively soft compared to other stones 5-6 on Mohs hardness scale, which makes it carvable, but it's brittle. It fractures unpredictably if you don't understand its internal structure. The pyrite inclusions create weak points. The calcite veining affects how it splits. A craftsman needs experience to shape lapis without ruining it. Sumerian craftsmen had that experience. The cylindrical beads from the royal cemetery show sophisticated drilling techniques, perfectly centered holes drilled from both ends to meet in the middle, indicating advanced use of bow drills and steady hands. The inlaid panels show careful matching of stone colors to create visual effects. This isn't experimental learning, this is mastery, which implies generations of practice, which implies steady supply, which implies the trade routes were ancient even when the royal cemetery was new. Archaeological sites along the plausible trade routes show evidence of periodic occupation by traders. Tepe Yahya in southeastern Iran shows lapis lazuli workshop debris, fragments, failed drills, polishing debris dated to the 3rd millennium BC. This wasn't a destination, this was a processing station. Rough stone arrived from the east, got worked into more finished forms, and continued west. The site sits directly on a logical route between Afghanistan and Mesopotamia. Shari Sokhta in eastern Iran, near the Afghan border, shows similar evidence, a large settlement with clear connections to both the Iranian plateau and regions further east. Lapis appears in workshops and graves. The site dates from 3200 to 1800 BC, spanning the entire period we're discussing. It didn't emerge suddenly, it was there, functioning as a node in a larger network, from the beginning of Sumerian literacy. These sites suggest the infrastructure was in place, but infrastructure requires maintenance. Trade routes through remote regions don't sustain themselves. Someone has to keep the wells cleared. Someone has to negotiate with local populations. Someone has to remember the routes across deserts where landmarks shift. Someone has to maintain relationships with the miners in those mountain valleys. That requires not just commerce, but cultural continuity, multi-generational transmission of knowledge, fathers teaching sons which stars to follow, which valleys to avoid, which seasonal floods close, which passes. This isn't information you invent. This is information you inherit. The tablets from Mesopotamia preserve the destination end of this knowledge chain. They record arrival, distribution, and use. But they don't record the journey. They don't explain how the first Sumerian merchants knew to head northeast toward mountains they couldn't see, across deserts they'd never crossed, to find a blue stone in a remote valley. They record the result as if the cause was self-evident. In Sumerian mythology, lapis lazuli appears as divine material. The goddess Inanna's throne is made of lapis. The heavens themselves are described as lapis. It's not just valuable, it's celestial, connected to the realm of the gods. This is the same stone that comes from a specific mountain range in Afghanistan, but the myths don't mention Afghanistan. They mention heaven. What if the mythology preserved a different kind of memory? Not market knowledge, but cultural memory of a time when materials and their sources were understood differently, when the blue stone wasn't a commodity from a known location, but a gift from a sacred origin, and the journey to obtain it was pilgrimage as much as commerce? The tablets don't say. They simply record 10 manna of lapis lazuli received from the merchant Lunana, stored in the temple treasury, allocated to the jeweller Urnin Shuba for the creation of a divine statue. The stone travelled 1,500 miles. The knowledge of where to find it travelled even further through time, and somewhere in the gap between the mine and the temple vault, between the earliest tablets and the routes they take for granted, lies a question the Sumerians never thought to answer because they never thought to ask it. Who taught them where the blue stone sleeps? Textiles as wealth. If you asked a Sumerian merchant in 2100 BIC to name his city's most valuable export, he wouldn't say grain. He wouldn't say dates or fish or wool in its raw form. He would say textiles, finished cloth. The tablets are clear on this. In the export records, in the merchant accounts, in the lists of goods sent to Dilmun and traded for copper and exotic materials, textiles dominate. Tablet MVN 13, 710 from the Year 3 period, records the monthly textile production of a single workshop attached to the temple complex at Girsu. The numbers are staggering: 546 finished garments of various types in 1 month. That's not counting the raw cloth that would be cut and sewn elsewhere. That's finished, quality-controlled, standardised garments ready for export or domestic distribution. 1 workshop, 1 month, 546 pieces. Scale that across all the temple workshops in a major city, add the production from private workshops, extend it across multiple cities, and you're looking at industrial output. This wasn't cottage industry. This was systematic mass production. The Sumerian economy, contrary to popular imagination, wasn't based on grain surplus. Grain was essential for feeding the population, yes, but grain was bulky, relatively low value for its weight, and difficult to transport long distances without spoilage or pests. Grain stayed mostly local. What travelled, what generated wealth, what paid for all those exotic imports we've been discussing, that was cloth. Let's talk about why. A bolt of high-quality wool cloth, dyed and finished, could weigh perhaps 5 pounds. 1 donkey could carry 50 to 75 pounds comfortably, meaning 10 to 15 bolts per animal. Compare that to grain. The same donkey carrying grain might transport the equivalent of 2 or 3 days' rations for a family. Which would a merchant rather haul across 1,000 miles of desert, cloth that will buy him lapis lazuli and copper, or grain that will buy him a few meals? But quality cloth didn't appear spontaneously. It required infrastructure, skill, standardization, and organization that rivals anything in the modern world. Start with the sheep. The Sumerians maintained massive flocks, Administrative tablets from Drehem, which we'll explore in detail later, record tens of thousands of sheep moving through the redistributive economy annually. These weren't wild animals. These were carefully bred, managed flocks producing wool with specific characteristics. The wool standards referenced in administrative texts distinguish between multiple grades of fleece, from finest to coarsest. Shearing happened seasonally. The wool then required cleaning, removing dirt, lanolin, plant matter. This was labour-intensive work, typically assigned to women and children. The clean wool then needed carding or combing to align the fibres before spinning. Spinning was skilled work. The tablets distinguish between multiple types of thread based on thickness and quality. Thread too loosely spun would create weak fabric. Thread too tightly spun would be difficult to weave and produce stiff cloth. Consistency mattered enormously. For standardized textile production, you need standardized thread, which means trained spinners producing uniform results. Then comes weaving. Sumerian looms were vertical weighted looms, with warp threads hanging vertically, held taut by clay or stone weights. Weft threads were woven horizontally using a shuttle. A skilled weaver could produce several feet of cloth per day, depending on the fineness of the thread and complexity of the pattern. But the tablets make clear that not all cloth was created equal. They distinguish between multiple textile types: Jenna cloth, Barsi cloth, Bardul cloth, Ubar cloth, and many others. Some of these terms likely refer to weave patterns, others to quality grades, still others to intended use. The vocabulary is extensive and specific. This isn't generic cloth. This is specialized terminology for a sophisticated industry. After weaving came finishing. Some cloth was fulled, pounded, and worked to tighten the weave and improve texture. Some was bleached. Some was dyed. The dyeing process itself required substantial expertise. Different dyes required different mordants to bind colour to fibre. Red dyes came from madder root, blues from woad or indigo, purples, the most expensive, from murex shellfish. Each colour required different processing methods and produced different grades of permanence. The final products were graded and marked. Tablet texts reference quality inspections. Defective cloth was valued lower than perfect cloth. Standards existed. You couldn't just ship any fabric and call it done. Now, why does all this matter? Because this level of standardization and quality control doesn't develop organically from household production. When your grandmother makes you a blanket, she does it her way. It's unique. It's personal. It's not standardized. For an industry to produce thousands of garments to the same specifications, you need written standards that can be referenced, training systems that produce consistent results, quality control inspections, administrative oversight to manage the workflow, shared understanding across multiple, workshops of what constitutes each grade of cloth, all of which the tablets show existed in the Year 3 period. But the Year 3 period wasn't the beginning of textile production. The vocabulary, the standards, the administrative structures were already mature. The system was already running. Administrative text BM 15285 from the British Museum, dating to the Old Akkadian period 2300, uses the same textile terminology as later Year 3 texts. Same quality distinctions, same measurement units, same bureaucratic formulas. The industry was ancient before the tablets recorded it. Why textiles became valuable makes intuitive sense. Everyone needs clothing. But why Sumerian textiles specifically commanded premium prices in distant markets requires explanation. The answer lies in those standards. A merchant in Dilmun buying Sumerian cloth knew what he was getting. The gear designation meant specific quality. The measurements were reliable. The colours were fast. This predictability had value. Contrast that with acquiring cloth from less organised sources. Maybe it's high quality, maybe it's not. Maybe the dimensions are accurate, maybe they're not. Maybe the dye will last, maybe it will fade in a season. Uncertainty has costs. Standardization reduces uncertainty. The Sumerians had standardization, which means they had the administrative capacity to enforce it, which means they had writing, bureaucracy, oversight, and probably penalties for violations, all of which requires sophisticated governmental organisation, and all of which appears in the earliest texts as already established. Here's where it becomes interesting. Tablet Nick 2, 429 from the Nikolsky collection records a merchant's expedition to Dilmun. The cargo list includes specific quantities of textile types destined for trade. The return cargo lists copper, lapis lazuli, and carnelian beads. The transaction is routine enough to use standard administrative language. This particular merchant made this journey multiple times, with his journeys tracked across several tablets. But Dilmun was Bahrain, over 500 miles by sea from Ur. The merchant had to load his ship, sail down the Gulf, spend weeks in Dilmun negotiating trades, load the return cargo, and sail back. Then he had to account for everything: what he took, what he traded, what he brought back, what he owed the palace or temple that financed the voyage, what profit he retained. The entire expedition was predicated on Dilmun wanting Sumerian cloth. Not needing it desperately, Dilmun had its own textile production, wanting it specifically because Sumerian cloth had reputation, quality, and standardization that commanded premium prices. How did that reputation develop? How did markets 500 miles away come to value Sumerian textiles above others? Reputation requires time. It requires consistent delivery of quality goods over multiple transactions, probably over generations. The first Sumerian merchant to reach Dilmun couldn't trade on reputation. He had nothing established yet. He had to convince Dilmun traders that his cloth was worth importing. Subsequent merchants built on that foundation. Eventually, Sumerian cloth meant something. It signified quality. But the tablets don't record this reputation-building process. By the time we have records, the reputation already exists. The trade routes are established. The quality standards are fixed. The whole system is operational. It's that phrase again, already established. Women did most of the textile work. The tablets are explicit about this. The weaving workshops employed primarily women, often organised under female overseers. Some of these women appear to have been enslaved labourers. Others seem to have been free workers receiving rations. The social organisation was complex, hierarchical, and carefully recorded. But here's a detail that's easy to miss. Some of the female overseers appear in tablets spanning multiple decades. They weren't temporary supervisors. They were career administrators, managing production workshops over their entire adult lives. They knew every detail of the process. They trained the workers. They ensured quality. They interfaced with the bureaucracy. These were experts, and their expertise was transmitted through generations. Daughters learned from mothers. Younger supervisors learned from older ones. The knowledge base was cumulative. This is how complex industries persist, not through written manuals, though those probably existed, through embodied knowledge, transmitted person to person, maintained through practice. The tablets record the outputs and transactions. The women preserved the craft itself, and that craft, that accumulated knowledge of how to breed sheep for quality fleece, how to clean and prepare wool, how to spin consistent thread, how to weave tight cloth, how to dye it colours that last, all of that had to come from somewhere. It had to be learned and refined over time. The tablets show the system already mature, which means the learning happened earlier. How much earlier? The textile vocabulary exists in the earliest written texts. The industry was old before literacy began. What if the Sumerians inherited textile knowledge the same way they inherited knowledge of distant stone sources and trade routes? What if the sophisticated workshops, the standardization, the quality controls were reconstructions of earlier systems, preserved through cultural memory and rebuilt in new cities? The cloth itself doesn't survive. Organic materials decompose. We have no Sumerian fabrics to examine except in rare, extraordinary preservation conditions. What survives are the records, the tablets listing quantities, qualities, destinations, and the wealth those textiles generated, the imports they paid for, the civilization they sustained. 546 garments in 1 month from one workshop. Someone had to shear the sheep, clean the wool, spin the thread, weave the cloth, inspect the results, package the goods, transport them to warehouses, catalogue the inventory, allocate portions to merchants, track the shipments, record the returns, calculate the profits, pay the workers, and maintain the infrastructure that made all of it possible. The tablets remember the system. The system remembers something older. What did the thread remember before anyone counted it? The Carnelian question. In the conservation labs of the University of Pennsylvania Museum, researchers examining beads from the Royal Cemetery at Ur noticed something peculiar. The carnelian beads, translucent orange-red stones, hundreds of them strung into necklaces buried with Queen Puabi around 2600 B, showed distinctive manufacturing characteristics. Parallel drill holes, precise cylindrical shapes, specific finishing techniques, particular methods of heat treatment to enhance colour. These techniques matched precisely those found on carnelian beads excavated at Harappan sites in the Indus Valley, places like Mohenjo-Daro, Charnhu-Daro, and Harappa itself, over 2,000 miles east of Ur. Not similar techniques, identical techniques. The implications are staggering. Carnelian is a form of chalcedony, a cryptocrystalline variety of quartz. It gets its orange to reddish-brown colour from iron oxide inclusions. High-quality carnelian, translucent, richly coloured, free of significant flaws, comes from specific geological contexts. The primary sources in the ancient world were the Indus Valley region, particularly Gujarat in modern India, parts of Iran, and some deposits in the Arabian Peninsula. But the beads in Sumerian contexts don't just contain carnelian from Indus sources. They show Indus manufacturing techniques, which means either Indus Valley craftsmen travelled to Mesopotamia and produced beads there. Finished beads were traded from the Indus Valley to Mesopotamia. Mesopotamian craftsmen learned and replicated Indus techniques with imported raw materials. Each option requires extensive contact between civilizations separated by 2,000 miles, multiple mountain ranges, vast deserts, and open ocean. Let's examine the bead-making process to understand what we're discussing. Start with raw carnelian nodules, rough, opaque stones extracted from geological deposits. These need to be selected for quality. Experienced lapidaries can assess internal structure by examining surface features, but there's always uncertainty until you begin working the stone. The rough stone is then chipped and shaped to approximate the final form. This requires understanding of how carnelian fractures. Unlike obsidian or flint, which break with predictable conchoidal fractures, carnelian is tougher and less predictable. You need experience to rough shape it efficiently without wasting material. Next comes drilling. Ancient lapidaries used bow drills, a weighted drill bit rotated by a bow, creating rotational force. The drill bits themselves were often made of harder stones like agate or, later, metal. The drilling medium was typically a slurry of abrasive crushed quartz sand mixed with water, which did the actual cutting. Here's where Indus Valley technique becomes distinctive. The beads show evidence of bidirectional drilling, starting from both ends and meeting in the middle. This requires precise alignment and incredible skill. If the angles are off by even a few degrees, the drill holes don't meet, and the bead is ruined. The Harappan craftsmen could do this consistently, producing perfectly centered holes in beads as small as 5 ME in diameter. Moreover, the drill holes show a specific profile, narrow at the entry points, slightly wider in the middle. This barbell profile results from particular drill rotation speeds and pressure application. It's a technique signature as distinctive as a fingerprint. After drilling comes polishing. Carnelian beads from both Indus and Sumerian contexts show high polish, achieved through progressive grinding with finer and finer abrasives, then buffing with leather or cloth. The final polish reveals the stone's translucency, allowing light to pass through and creating the warm glow that made carnelian desirable. Some beads also show evidence of heat treatment, gentle heating that drives off moisture and converts yellowish or brownish stones to richer reds and oranges. This requires knowledge of temperature control. Too hot and the stone cracks. Not hot enough and the colour doesn't change. The Indus craftsman knew the correct temperature range. All of these techniques, the bidirectional drilling, the barbell profile, the heat treatment, the specific polishing methods, appear in carnelian beads found at Ur. Tablet Mar 16064 from the old Akkadian period, held in the Louvre, lists carnelian beads among imported commodities. The text doesn't specify their source, but the quantity is notable, not a handful, but thousands of beads. This was trade at scale. The question becomes, how did this trade develop? The Indus Valley Civilization, what archaeologists call the Harappan civilization, flourished from approximately 3300 to 1300 BCE. Its major urban centres, like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, show sophisticated urban planning, standardized brick sizes, advanced drainage systems, and clear evidence of long-distance trade. Indus seals have been found in Mesopotamia. Mesopotamian objects have been found at Indus sites. The civilizations were in contact. But contact across 2,000 miles of difficult terrain requires explanation. The most plausible route involved maritime trade through the Persian Gulf. Ships from Mesopotamia sailed to Dilmun, which served as a transshipment centre. From Dilmun, ships could continue to Maganman, and from there along the coast toward the Indus Delta. Alternatively, goods could pass through multiple intermediaries, moving port to port in shorter hops. Archaeological evidence supports this. Dilmun seals, distinctive round seals with specific iconography, have been found at both Mesopotamian and Indus sites, suggesting Dilmun merchants traded with both civilizations. Magan, known for copper exports, also shows evidence of trade with the Indus. But here's what makes the carnelian beads remarkable. They required not just trade, but sustained demand. For Indus craftsmen to produce beads in styles and quantities suitable for Mesopotamian markets, they needed to know what Mesopotamian customers wanted. For Mesopotamian merchants to seek Indus beads specifically, they needed to know about Indus quality and availability. This implies regular contact, maintained over generations. Not a single voyage that established contact, but repeated journeys that built relationships, learned preferences, and created market expectations. Tablet YBC 7169 from the Yale Babylonian collection records a transaction involving carnelian beads, lapis lazuli, and gold components for a necklace. The administrative language treats these materials as equivalently available. The bureaucrat recording the receipt doesn't comment on the carnelian as exotic or difficult to obtain. It's routine inventory. For something to be routine, it has to be reliable. For something to be reliable, the supply chain has to be established and maintained. For a supply chain to function across 2,000 miles, multiple civilizations have to participate willingly and consistently, and somehow they did. Now consider the timeline. The royal cemetery at Ur, with its abundant carnelian beads, dates to around 2600 BCE, but the Indus Valley civilization's mature phase, when standardized bead production was clearly occurring, began around 2600 BCE. The trade contact appears to coincide with both civilizations reaching their sophisticated urban phases almost simultaneously. Mainstream archaeology treats this as convergent development, two civilizations independently developing advanced urban characteristics around the same time, and then discovering each other through exploratory trade. But there's another reading. What if both civilizations were rebuilding or elaborating on earlier patterns? What if the trade routes that connected them weren't new discoveries, but renewed pathways? What if the reason carnelian beads appear in early Mesopotamian contexts, already showing sophisticated manufacturing, is because the knowledge of where to get them and how they should look was inherited rather than discovered? The tablets don't say. They record receipt of beads, their integration into jewellery, their distribution to temples and workshops. They don't explain how anyone knew to seek beads from a civilization 2,000 miles away. The beads themselves are silent on their journey. They don't record the ship that carried them, the merchant who traded for them, the ports they passed through. They simply arrived, were catalogued, and entered the Sumerian economy as if their presence was natural and expected. But nothing about their presence was natural. Everything about their presence required knowledge, organisation, and continuity across vast distances and extended time. There's another detail worth noting. The bead necklaces from the royal cemetery aren't random assemblages. They show deliberate design. Carnelian beads alternate with lapis lazuli beads in patterns. Gold spacers separate sections. The colour combinations, red, orange, carnelian against deep blue lapis, are deliberately aesthetic. Someone designed these necklaces with an eye for visual harmony, which means someone in Ur had access to both carnelian beads from the Indus Valley and lapis lazuli beads from Afghanistan simultaneously in sufficient quantities to allow artistic choice. Not we'll use whatever arrives, but we'll design the piece we want and obtain the materials to execute that design. That level of reliable access to materials from sources 1,500 to 2,000 miles apart suggests a trade network of remarkable sophistication. Merchants who could source specific materials on demand, ships that sailed regularly enough that delivery was predictable, diplomatic or commercial relationships stable enough that access wasn't constantly disrupted. The tablets record the arrival of goods. They don't record the decades or centuries of relationship building that made that arrival possible. Carnelian beads are small things. You can hold dozens in your palm. They weigh almost nothing. A single necklace might be worth a fortune, but the physical object is insignificant. Yet each bead represents a chain of decisions. To extract stone from the earth in Gujarat, to train craftsmen in precise techniques, to manufacture beads to specifications, to transport them to ports, to load them on ships, to sail across the Gulf, to transfer them through intermediary markets, to deliver them to Mesopotamia, to catalogue them in warehouses, to allocate them to craftsmen, to integrate them into jewellery, to bury them with the dead. Each bead is a node in a network that spans half the ancient world, and the tablets record that network functioning smoothly, routinely, without surprise or comment, as if it had always been that way. What did the beads carry besides colour? What memories travel in translucent stone, drilled through with ancestral technique, sailing impossible distances to find their place in a Sumerian queen's necklace? The tablets don't answer. They simply count 73 carnelian beads, received, inventoried, distributed. The network remembers. Cedar, tin and copper, the strategic trinity. Cuneiform tablet TLM 1972.19170 from the Toledo Museum of Art, dating to the Old Akkadian period around 2300 BC, records the receipt of 44 manner of cedar and 9 manner of amber. The measurements are precise. The administrative vocabulary is standard. The transaction is bureaucratically unremarkable, except for what it represents. Cedar doesn't grow in Mesopotamia. The timber came from Lebanon, specifically from the mountain slopes of the Lebanon and Anti-Lebanon ranges, where Cedrus libani, the famous cedar of Lebanon, grows at elevations between 4,000 and 7,000 feet. The distance from Ur to the Lebanese coast is approximately 650 miles. The logs travelled that distance, either as whole timbers or cut planks, via overland caravan or river transport, across political boundaries through territories controlled by different peoples to supply construction needs in southern Mesopotamia, and they arrived regularly enough that receiving them required only standard accounting language. Cedar was essential, not luxury. Mesopotamian date palms provided wood suitable for small-scale uses, tool handles, basic furniture, small roof beams, but for temples, palaces, large residential structures and ships, You needed longer beams that wouldn't rot, warp, or succumb to insects. Cedar fit perfectly. It's naturally resistant to decay due to oil content. It's dimensionally stable. It's strong enough for structural use. It smells pleasant, which mattered in sacred contexts. And it grows in long, straight trunks, suitable for cutting into beams. The Epic of Gilgamesh, Mesopotamia's greatest literary work, famously includes an expedition to the cedar forest, where Gilgamesh and Enkidu journey to obtain cedar and defeat the guardian Humbaba. The story is mythologized, but the core reflects reality. Cedar was valuable enough to warrant major expeditions. Controlling cedar sources was strategic, but cedar was only one part of a trinity of strategic materials. The other two were copper and tin. Together, these materials enabled Bronze Age civilization. Copper appears in Mesopotamia in archaeological contexts from the earliest urban phases. Copper tools, copper weapons, copper vessels. Tablet IM 73355 from the Iraq Museum records copper deliveries measured in talents, large standardized weight units. The volumes are substantial. This wasn't occasional import. This was systematic supply. Copper sources nearest to Mesopotamia included Oman Shan, Anatolia, and the Iranian Plateau. The Oman sources are best documented. The site of Maysar in Oman shows extensive copper mining and smelting operations dating to the 3rd millennium BCE. Slag heaps, ore crushing areas, smelting furnaces, full industrial infrastructure for copper production. Ships carried this copper down the Persian Gulf to Mesopotamian ports. But copper alone is relatively soft, useful but limited. To make bronze, the material that defines the age, you need to alloy copper with tin. Bronze is harder than copper, holds an edge better, casts more readily, and has superior mechanical properties for tools and weapons. Tin is the problem. Tin sources are geographically rare. The primary sources available to ancient Near Eastern civilizations were in Afghanistan general region as lapis lazuli, Central Asia, and possibly Anatolia. The Afghan sources are most commonly cited. The same mountain regions that supplied lapis also contained cassiterite deposits. So we have copper from Oman 1200 mile, tin from Afghanistan 500 miles northeast, and cedar from Lebanon 650 miles northwest. 3 different directions, 3 different supply chains, 3 different sets of intermediaries, political relationships and logistical challenges. And somehow Bronze Age Mesopotamia maintained reliable access to all 3 simultaneously. Let's consider what this means practically. A Sumerian temple workshop wants to cast a bronze statue of a deity. They need copper from Oman or elsewhere, tin from Afghanistan or Central Asia, skilled metalworkers who know the correct alloy ratio, typically 90% copper, 10% tin, fuel for smelting, moulds or lost wax expertise, finishing tools. None of this happens spontaneously. You can't decide one day to cast a bronze statue and then hope the materials arrive. You have to plan. You have to order supplies months or years in advance. You have to maintain relationships with merchants who can source these materials. You have to store them securely until needed. You have to keep the knowledge alive, how to alloy properly, how to control temperature, how to finish the casting. And the tablets show this was routine. Bronze objects are common in archaeological contexts, not rare treasures. Common enough that broken bronze items were recycled, melted down, and recast. The metal was valuable, but access was reliable enough that bronze tools and weapons were standard equipment. Administrative tablet YBC 2246 from Yale records a delivery of copper and tin in specific ratios. The bureaucrat knew exactly what proportions were needed for bronze production. This wasn't guesswork. This was standardized knowledge. Now add cedar back into the picture. Bronze tools made it easier to work wood, but large-scale construction, temples with massive cedar beams for roofs, required planning and coordination at a civilizational level. You couldn't build a temple on speculation. You had to acquire the cedar, transport it hundreds of miles, have it ready when the construction crew needed it, and integrate it with other materials, riddick for walls, bitumen for waterproofing, gypsum for plaster. Temple construction projects documented in administrative texts span years or decades. The construction of the Temple of Ningirsu at Girsu, recorded in texts from the reign of Gudea around 2100 BC, involved cedar from Lebanon, diorite stone from Magan, gold from unknown northern sources, copper, silver, and numerous other imported materials. The project required coordinating deliveries from across the known world to meet construction schedules. This is logistics at a level that requires central authority, bureaucratic oversight, and probably written schedules and contracts, all of which existed. The tablets document it. But here's the question: how did they know it was possible? How did the first temple builder know that cedar could be obtained from Lebanon, that it would arrive in usable form, that the investment in sending a trade mission would pay off? How did the first bronze smith know that copper from one source could be alloyed with tin from another source 1,500 miles away to create a superior metal? The standard answer is gradual discovery through trial and error over generations. Merchants slowly expanded their range, discovered new sources, experimented with combinations, and eventually built up the knowledge base. But the tablets don't show gradual discovery, they show mature systems. By the time we have written records, the cedar trade is established, the copper trade is established, the tin trade is established, bronze production is standardized, the knowledge exists and functions smoothly. It's that pattern again. The moment literacy allows us to see the system is already complete. There's a text fragment from the Library of Ashurbanipal, much later than the period we're discussing, but copying earlier sources, that lists tin among materials obtained from distant lands since days of old. The phrase suggests antiquity beyond the scribes' reckoning. Tin trade wasn't recent, it was ancient even to ancient scribes. The strategic trinity, cedar, copper, tin, wasn't luxury, it was necessity. Without cedar, you couldn't build large structures or seagoing ships. Without copper, you couldn't make effective tools. Without tin, you couldn't make bronze. And without bronze, you couldn't compete militarily, couldn't produce the tools needed for advanced crafts, couldn't fully participate in the technological baseline of the age. Civilizations that lost access to these materials fell behind. Maintaining access was existential, which means maintaining the trade networks, the diplomatic relationships, the maritime routes, the caravan paths, all of it was civilizational priority. The tablets record successful maintenance. They record arrivals, distributions, allocations. They don't record the failures, the caravans that didn't return, the ships that sank, the negotiations that collapsed. But those failures must have happened. Trade at this scale, across these distances, with these risks, had to experience disruption. Yet the system persisted for centuries, which suggests redundancy, alternative routes, strategic reserves, and probably diplomatic or military backing to ensure access when commercial relationships proved insufficient. The old Akkadian tablet from Toledo, with its 44 manner of cedar, represents one successful transaction in a stream of successful transactions extending across generations. The cedar arrived, someone counted it, someone recorded the count, someone allocated it to construction projects. The system worked, and working systems tend to be systems that have been working for a long time. What if the strategic trinity wasn't assembled through gradual discovery? What if the knowledge of what materials were necessary, where they could be found, and how to obtain them was inherited? What if Bronze Age Mesopotamia was rebuilding supply chains rather than building them for the first time? The tablets don't speculate, they count. 44 manner of cedar, received, stored, allocated. The forests of Lebanon remember the axes. The mountains of Oman remember the miners. The valleys of Afghanistan remember the caravans. And the tablets remember the numbers, preserving the flow of materials, that made civilization possible without explaining how anyone knew the flow should exist at all. The merchant class. In the earliest texts from Far arthropods, dating to around 2600 BC, a professional designation appears repeatedly, damgar, the Sumerian word for merchant. The symbol is clear, distinctive, and used consistently across multiple tablets. These merchants aren't being described as a new profession, aren't being defined for readers unfamiliar with the concept. They simply appear in the texts as established members of the economic structure. By 2600 BC, when writing itself was barely 300 years old, still mostly pictographic, still primarily used for basic accounting, merchants were already a recognized professional class with specific roles, responsibilities, and administrative status. This requires explanation. Merchants don't emerge spontaneously. The profession requires certain preconditions: surplus production worth trading, distant demand for those products, ability to travel safely over long distances, capital to finance expeditions, knowledge of routes, markets and languages, trust mechanisms, reputation, enforcement too, ensure transactions complete, social status that allows accumulation and retention of wealth. All of these had to exist before merchant could be a profession, and all of them existed in Sumer by 2600 BC, so early that writing was just beginning to record economic complexity. Tablet Ts 344 from the Phara corpus records the activities of several named merchants, tracking their movements between cities and their receipt of goods. The administrative structure is sophisticated. The merchants aren't freelancers operating outside institutional oversight. They work within systems that track them, finance them, and expect accounting from them. Who organised this system? When did it begin? The merchants themselves left traces across the tablets. Ludingira, mentioned earlier, operated during the Year 3 period. Tablet evidence tracks his career across years, receiving silver allocations from the state, travelling to various cities, trading for commodities, returning goods to state warehouses, and receiving rations for his service. He wasn't an independent operator, he was an agent within a state-run commercial apparatus. But the relationship wasn't purely bureaucratic. Some tablets show merchants trading on their own account, retaining portions of profit beyond their state-allocated rations. The system allowed personal enterprise within regulated frameworks. Merchants could become wealthy, own property, and pass status to their children. The word damgar itself is interesting. Etymologically, it may derive from roots meaning district and seeker or traveller, someone who travels to different regions. The profession was defined by movement, by the act of carrying goods between places. This required particular knowledge. Routes through deserts had to be memorised, which wells still functioned, where seasonal floods made passages dangerous, when mountain passes became impassable. Coastal navigation required understanding of winds, currents, and safe harbours. Knowledge of languages, customs, and diplomatic protocols in foreign lands was essential. You couldn't trade successfully in Dilmun if you didn't understand Dilmun commercial practices. All of this knowledge had to be learned. Merchants served apprenticeships, travelled with experienced traders, and absorbed practical wisdom that couldn't be written down. When tablets record a merchant's journey, they record only the accounting, goods taken, goods returned. They don't record the navigational decisions, the negotiations, the problems solved on the road. That knowledge lived in people and was transmitted person to person across generations. Tablet BM 16439 from the British Museum, dating to the Old Akkadian period, records a merchant named Uninmar receiving goods for a trading mission to Magan-Man. The goods include textiles and silver, standard Mesopotamian exports. The expected return cargo includes copper. This wasn't Uninmar's first voyage. His name appears in multiple tablets, suggesting he made this journey regularly. It was his profession, probably his father's profession before him, possibly his son's profession after him. Merchants formed lineages. The knowledge, contacts, and capital accumulated over one lifetime could be passed to the next generation. This created continuity. A merchant family might maintain relationships with partners in distant cities for generations. Trust built over decades created commercial advantages that outsiders couldn't easily replicate. The tablets capture snapshots of this continuity, father and son pairs appearing in texts from different years, merchant names recurring across decades in the same trade routes, evidence of long-term commercial relationships. But the system was already old when the tablets began recording it. Consider what has to exist before merchants can function systematically. Legal frameworks, contracts, enforcement mechanisms, resolution of disputes. Tablet NBC 8770 from Yale records a contract between a merchant and a financing partner, specifying terms of a trading voyage. If one party violates terms, there must be recourse. This implies legal structures, courts or administrative bodies that hear cases, and penalties that can be enforced. Financial instruments, credit, loans, interest, partnerships. Merchants couldn't personally finance all expeditions. They borrowed capital, formed partnerships where multiple investors shared risk, and negotiated interest rates for borrowed silver. The tablets show all of this was routine. Quality standards, for trade to be systematic, goods must be predictable. The textile quality standards we discussed earlier mattered enormously for merchants. A merchant promising to deliver 50 bolts of neckcloth to Dillman needed assurance that the workshops would produce to specification. Standardization enabled commerce at scale. Information networks. Knowing what goods were valuable where required intelligence gathering. Merchants needed to know when Dillman had surplus copper to trade, when Magan's mines were producing heavily, when political instability in the north disrupted overland routes. This information flowed through merchant networks. The tablets don't record these communications, but they must have existed. Physical infrastructure, warehouses, docks, roads where they existed, caravanserais, water sources along routes. Someone had to maintain these. The state provided some. Private merchant associations probably maintained others. Without infrastructure, long-distance trade becomes exponentially more difficult. All of this existed in systematic form by the early dynastic period. The tablets from 2600 BC document merchants operating within this complete framework. Standard archaeology suggests this framework developed gradually as cities grew and trade needs expanded. Population increase created surpluses. Surpluses enabled specialization. Specialization allowed merchants to emerge. And over generations, the supporting structures evolved. But there's another reading. What if the merchant class, like the trade routes and the knowledge of distant materials, was being reconstituted rather than invented? What if merchants in early dynastic Sumer were rebuilding a profession that had existed before, carrying forward practices preserved through oral tradition and embodied knowledge? The tablets don't directly address this, but they hint at it through their consistency. The commercial vocabulary, the accounting methods, the administrative procedures all appear fully formed in the earliest texts. There's no developmental phase visible in the written record. Writing becomes sophisticated enough to document commerce, and commerce is already sophisticated. Tablet M52685 from the Iraq Museum records a commercial dispute between two merchants. The arbitration procedure, the witnesses called, the resolution mechanism, all suggest established precedent. This wasn't the first dispute. This was routine application of known procedures. Procedures become routine through repetition. Repetition requires time. The dispute tablet from 2300 BCC documents the endpoint of a long process of practice and precedent. How long, the tablets don't say, but they preserve the result, a merchant class operating professionally within legal and administrative frameworks, conducting trade across vast distances, managing capital, sharing risk, accumulating wealth, and transmitting their profession across generations. The merchants themselves were the living memory of the networks. Each voyage reinforced knowledge of routes, partners, and markets. Each transaction strengthened relationships. Each generation trained the next in practical wisdom that couldn't be codified. Ernin Mars sailing to Magon wasn't just transporting goods, he was maintaining a relationship. He was embodying accumulated knowledge of navigation, negotiation, and commerce. He was a node in a network that extended across the known world and backward through time. The tablets count his cargo. They don't count his knowledge, but his knowledge made the cargo possible. And that knowledge came from somewhere, was learnt from someone, was preserved through practice and teaching and lived experience across generations whose own tablets have crumbled to dust, or haven't yet been excavated, or were never written, because the knowledge was too obvious to need recording. The merchants travelled. The knowledge travelled with them, and what they carried invisibly, roots, languages, relationships, trust, technique, was perhaps more valuable than what they carried in their packs. The tablets record transactions, the merchants remember the paths. Dilmun, Magan, Meluha, the named worlds. In the cuneiform texts, 3 names appear with striking consistency when scribes record foreign trade: Dilmun, Magan, and Meluha, not generic terms for distant lands, specific names for specific places, each associated with specific trade goods, each occupying a distinct position in Sumerian geographical understanding. This precision requires attention. Dilmun appears first and most frequently. Tablet Yos 435 from Yale's Babylonian collection records shipments to and from Dilmun with bureaucratic regularity. Dilmun supplied dates, onions, fish, and acted as an entrepot for goods from more distant sources. Archaeological evidence strongly identifies Dilmun with Bahrain and perhaps the eastern Arabian coast, islands and shorelines in the Persian Gulf. The journey from Ur to Bahrain by sea covered approximately 500-600 miles down the Gulf. Favourable winds could make the journey in perhaps 10 days to 2 weeks. This was entirely doable with Bronze Age maritime technology, but it required seagoing vessels, not riverboats. It required navigation across open water, out of sight of land. It required knowledge of currents, seasonal wind patterns, and safe harbours. And the Sumerians made this journey repeatedly. Merchant tablets tracking voyages to Dilmun spanned decades. The route was established, reliable, and actively maintained. But Dilmun wasn't just a destination, it was a hub. Goods from further east, from Magan and Meluha, passed through Dilmun on their way to Mesopotamia. Dilmun merchants acted as intermediaries, buying exotic materials from distant sources and selling them to Mesopotamian traders. How did Dilmun develop this intermediary role? The conventional explanation is geographical advantage. Dilmun sat at a natural midpoint in Gulf trade routes. But advantage doesn't create networks by itself. Someone had to establish the relationships, build the trust, create the commercial infrastructure that made Dilmun a reliable trading partner. And that someone had to do it before the earliest tablets record it, because the tablets treat Dilmun trade as routine from the beginning. Magan appears in texts associated primarily with copper. Tablet Im 73821 from the Iraq Museum lists copper receipts from Magan in substantial quantities. Archaeological surveys of the Oman Peninsula, the most widely accepted identification for Magan, reveal extensive ancient copper mining operations. The sites at Mesar and elsewhere show slag heaps, ore processing areas, and smelting furnaces dated to the 3rd millennium BC. The copper from Magan moved through Dilmun to Mesopotamia, or sometimes via direct shipment from Omani ports. The distance from Oman to Ur by sea, hugging the northern Gulf coast, was approximately 1,200 miles. This required multi-week voyages with provisions, water storage, and robust enough vessels to handle open water. Omani copper appears in Mesopotamian artifacts from very early periods. By the time tablets record it, the trade is established. But the mining operations in Oman required labour, organisation, and presumably payment or trade goods from Mesopotamia. Someone had to coordinate this. Mesopotamian merchants had to know that Oman possessed copper deposits worth exploiting. Omani populations had to have reasons to mine copper specifically for export rather than just local use. This implies contact, negotiation, and mutual interest maintained over time. Then there's Meluhha, the most distant, the most exotic, the most mysterious of the three. Meluhha appears in texts associated with carnelian beads, specific timbers, exotic animals, and various luxury goods. The identification of Meluhha with the Indus Valley civilization has strong archaeological support. Indus seals have been found at Mesopotamian sites. Mesopotamian objects have been found at Indus sites. The carnelian beads we discussed earlier show Indus manufacturing techniques. The connections are clear. But the distance is staggering. From Ur to the Indus Delta is roughly 2,000 miles by sea, requiring navigation around the Arabian Peninsula or across the Arabian Sea. This wasn't coastal hopping, this was open ocean sailing. Alternatively, goods moved through intermediaries, Dilmun merchants buying from Magan merchants who bought from Meluhha contacts. Multi-stage trade chains where goods passed through several hands before reaching Mesopotamia. Either scenario requires remarkable commercial coordination. Direct voyages required advanced maritime technology and navigation knowledge. Intermediate trade required stable relationships across multiple cultures and languages, with each stage trusting that the next would honour agreements. And somehow it worked, reliably enough that Meluhhan goods appear in Mesopotamian contexts throughout the 3rd millennium BC. What's striking about these three names, Dilmun, Magan, Meluhha, is their specificity and consistency. They aren't vague references to the east or across the sea. They're proper names, places with identities, known geography, and associated characteristics. The Sumerian texts describe Dilmun as a place of dates and fresh water. Enki and Nin-Hursag, a Sumerian myth, describes Dilmun as a paradise-like land. While mythologized, the core reflects actual trade. Dilmun did export dates and perhaps fresh water to water-scarce Mesopotamian cities. Magan is described in terms of copper, diorite stone, and certain timbers. Exactly what archaeological evidence shows Oman produced and exported. Meluhha is associated with luxury goods, exotic materials, things from the ends of the earth. The mystique reflects distance, but the trade was real. The texts don't explain how the Sumerians first learned about these places. They don't record an age of exploration where adventurous sailors ventured into unknown waters and returned with news of distant lands. By the time we have texts, the distant lands are known, named, and integrated into Mesopotamian trade networks. Tablet Nick 2, 429, mentioned earlier, shows merchant voyages to Dilmun as routine administrative events. The merchant departs with cargo, returns with different cargo, and accounts for the transaction. There's no sense of adventure, no indication that the journey was unusual or risky beyond normal commercial risk. This implies the routes were well established, the destinations familiar, and the trade relationships stable. How long did it take to reach that level of stability? Decades? Centuries? Archaeological evidence from Dilmun sites shows Mesopotamian contact from the mid-3rd millennium BC at least, but the contact patterns suggest earlier interaction. The commercial relationships visible in 2500 BC required foundation time to develop. Magan's copper trade shows similar patterns. By the time tablets document it, it's systematic. The Omani mines were producing, Mesopotamian merchants were receiving shipments, and the whole operation functioned smoothly enough to supply Bronze Age civilizations' copper needs. Meluhha contact is more enigmatic because the Indus Valley civilization left minimal deciphered writing. We know contact existed, we don't know its full extent or how it was organized, but Indus goods in Mesopotamia and Mesopotamian goods in the Indus imply reciprocal trade, which implies communication, negotiation, and mutual benefit. Three civilizations, Mesopotamia, Indus Valley, and the intermediary cultures in between, somehow coordinated trade across 2,000 miles. 3 different language families, 3 different cultural traditions, 3 different political systems, and yet goods flowed, merchants travelled, and tablets recorded arrivals as routine. The administrative text MBC 4601 from Yale's collection lists arrivals from all 3 sources in a single accounting period. Dilmun dates, Magan copper, Meluhan carnelian, all present, all accounted for, all integrated into the Mesopotamian economy simultaneously. This wasn't accident, this was a network. A network requires architecture, nodes, connections, flows, protocols. The tablets record the flows. They don't record who designed the architecture or when it was built, but they preserve the names. Dilmun, Magan, Meluha, each name a memorial to connections that predated the tablets, maintained through practice, embedded in commercial routine, and taken for granted by scribes who never thought to explain how their ancestors first learnt those names or why those particular places became central to Mesopotamian trade. The names remember, the tablets preserve the names, and the goods flowed, bearing materials from distant worlds into Sumerian hands, as if the network had always existed, waiting only for writing to notice it. The perfume paradox. Among the commodities documented in Mesopotamian trade records, one category stands apart for its apparent superfluity: aromatics. Frankincense, myrrh, exotic oils, resins, and ingredients for perfumes and incense. These weren't tools, they weren't food, they weren't structural materials, they were scents, smells, ephemeral experiences that vanished with the air that carried them, and yet merchants travelled hundreds of miles to obtain them. Temples allocated significant resources to purchase them. Craftsmen specialised in combining them into perfumes and incense. Administrative tablets tracked their receipt and distribution with the same precision applied to grain and silver. Why? The tablets from Larsa, a city in southern Mesopotamia, provide unusual insight. Several administrative texts from the Old Babylonian period document an aromatics industry centred in the city. Workers received rations, raw materials were tracked, finished products were distributed. The scale suggests professional production, not small-scale household craft. But the raw materials themselves came from extraordinary distances. Frankincense comes from boswellia trees, which grow in southern Arabia, Yemen and Oman, and the Horn of Africa, Uron. The resin is harvested by cutting the bark and collecting the sap that oozes out and hardens. High-quality frankincense has a distinct spicy sweet aroma when burned. It was one of the most valuable trade goods of the ancient world. Myrrh comes from commiphora trees, found in the same regions as frankincense, southern Arabia and the Horn of Africa. The resin has a more bitter, earthy scent than frankincense. Ancient texts distinguish multiple grades of myrrh based on quality and origin. Both materials required trade routes extending far south of Mesopotamia, down the Arabian Peninsula, or across the Red Sea to Africa. These routes involved either overland caravan travel through Arabian deserts or maritime trade along Arabian coasts, both difficult and dangerous. Other aromatics came from equally distant sources. Certain oils required ingredients from India or Southeast Asia. Aromatic woods came from various regions. The perfume recipes documented in Mesopotamian texts show complex mixtures of ingredients from multiple geographic sources. This wasn't simple procurement. This was coordinated sourcing of exotic materials for what amounts to sensory pleasure. The question becomes, why did this trade exist? Who decided these particular scents were desirable enough to warrant the expense and risk of long-distance trade? The obvious answer is religious practice. Incense burning was central to Mesopotamian temple rituals. The gods, according to Sumerian theology, appreciated pleasant aromas. Offering incense was an act of worship. Major temples consumed substantial quantities. But this just pushes the question back one step. Why did religious practice centre on these specific aromatics? How did anyone know that frankincense from southern Arabia was the appropriate offering? How did the tradition establish itself? Tablet YBC 4665 from Yale records the distribution of aromatics for temple use. The quantities are specific. So many measures of frankincense for the morning ritual, different quantities for evening rituals, special allocations for festivals. The precision suggests long established practice. These weren't experimental offerings, these were traditional requirements. Where did the tradition come from? There's a larger pattern here worth considering. The materials that Mesopotamian civilization valued most: lapis from Afghanistan, carnelian from India, tin from distant mountain regions, aromatics from southern Arabia and Africa, all required knowledge of places far beyond Mesopotamian borders. Not just knowledge that these places existed, but specific knowledge of what materials they produced and how those materials could be used. Someone had to taste enough varieties of aromatic resin to determine that frankincense and myrrh were worth importing. Someone had to experiment with burning different resins to discover their aromatic properties. Someone had to develop recipes for combining aromatics into perfumes. Someone had to establish that these particular scents were appropriate for religious contexts. All of this requires time, experimentation, and cultural transmission. The knowledge base reflected in the tablets is extensive and specialized. The Lhasa Aromatics text reference workers with specific titles, apparently specialists in perfume production. These weren't generic labourers. These were trained professionals who understood aromatic properties, mixing ratios, and application methods. Training such specialists requires existing knowledge to transmit. You can't teach perfume making unless someone already knows perfume making, which means the knowledge predated the specialists we see documented, who in turn transmitted it to later specialists, creating continuity across generations. One particularly interesting text from the old Babylonian period lists ingredients for a perfume recipe. The ingredients include aromatic resins, various plant-based oils, mineral additives, specific preparation instructions. The recipe reads like something from a specialist's manual. It assumes the reader understands the terminology, knows the ingredients, and possesses the skill to execute the procedure. It's not explanatory, it's technical notation for experienced practitioners. This implies a community of practice, multiple perfume makers who shared vocabulary, techniques, and standards. Such communities don't spring into existence. They develop over time through training, through shared work, through transmission of specialized knowledge. The tablets capture a snapshot of this community in action. But the community had history before the snapshot, history that shaped its practices and knowledge. Here's where it becomes philosophically interesting. Aromatics represent a particular kind of value, sensory experience. They don't satisfy physical needs like food or shelter. They don't provide practical utility like tools or weapons. Their value is entirely cultural, based on shared appreciation of particular sensory qualities. But cultural values don't appear randomly. They emerge from contexts, traditions, and meanings that communities develop and maintain. For aromatics to have the significance they clearly had in Mesopotamian culture, significant enough to drive long-distance trade, there must have been cultural narratives explaining why these scents mattered. Some narratives survive in mythological texts. The gods appreciate pleasant aromas. Incense sanctifies sacred spaces. Perfumes mark special occasions. But these explanations are descriptive, not explanatory. They tell us that aromatics were valued, not why that valuation emerged. What if the value of aromatics, like the knowledge of distant material sources, was inherited rather than developed? What if the cultural appreciation of frankincense and myrrh carried forward from earlier contexts where those scents had significance? The tablets don't address this. They simply record 10 manna of frankincense received from merchant Luia, 5 manna of myrrh allocated to the temple workshop, 3 portions of mixed aromatics distributed for perfume production. The scents themselves are gone, burned in ancient temples, evaporated from ancient perfume jars, dissipated into air that has long since circled the globe and mixed into modern atmosphere. The physical substances are lost, but the records remain. Lists of ingredients, quantities received, distributions made, the administrative shadow of sensory experiences 4,000 years gone. And in that shadow, a question: what did those scents mean to the people who valued them? What memories or associations did frankincense carry? What did myrrh signify beyond its immediate aroma? The tablets don't preserve meaning, they preserve transactions. But behind every transaction was a reason, a valuation, a judgment that this particular scent was worth the extraordinary effort required to obtain it. Someone made those judgments and passed them forward, until scribes in Larsa, centuries later, recorded aromatics receipts as routine administrative tasks, never wondering why anyone cared about perfume in the first place. The aromatics trade is a paradox, utterly unnecessary for survival, absolutely central to culture, requiring vast commercial infrastructure to satisfy what amounts to aesthetic preference. Unless it wasn't just aesthetic, unless the sense carried something else, memory perhaps, tradition, connection to something older that the Sumerians themselves might not have fully understood, but nonetheless preserved through practice. Burn frankincense. The smoke rises, the scent spreads, and for a moment the temple smells the way temples should smell, the way they've always smelled, the way they smelled before anyone wrote down why that particular scent mattered. The tablets count the resin, they don't count the memories. Drahim, the redistribution engine. 12 miles southeast of ancient Nippur, archaeologists excavating in the early 20th century uncovered a site that locals called Drahim. The ancient name was Pusrish Dagon, meaning secret of the god Dagon. The excavations revealed not a typical city, but something stranger, an administrative centre dedicated almost entirely to livestock processing and commodity redistribution. The tablets recovered from Pusrish Dagon number in the tens of thousands. They date primarily to the Ur-3 period, particularly the reigns of Shulgi and Amarsin around 2100-2050 BC, and they document a bureaucratic operation of staggering scale. Tablet Chess 4-168 from the Harvard Semitic Museum collection, dating to the 46th year of Shulgi's reign, records the receipt of 276 cattle, 1,847 sheep, and 94 goats in a single accounting period. These animals weren't raised at Pusrish Dagon. They were delivered from various sources across the Ur-3 state, processed at Pusrish Dagon, and redistributed to temples, palace households, and military units. This was happening constantly, day after day, month after month, year after year. The tablets record a continuous flow of livestock arriving, being slaughtered or redistributed alive, and exiting as meat, leather, wool, or living animals sent to new destinations. Why did Pusrish Dagon exist? What purpose did this centralized processing serve? The Ur-3 state organized its economy around redistributive principles. Production across the empire, agricultural goods, craft products, livestock, flowed to central collection points where state administrators reallocated resources according to planned needs. This wasn't market economy, this was command economy. Pusrish Dagon functioned as the livestock node in this network. Animals raised across southern Mesopotamia moved to Pusrish Dagon for accounting, slaughter and redistribution. The central location, near Nippur, a major religious centre, made sense logistically, but the scale required extraordinary administrative capacity. Consider what had to happen for the system to function. Record all arrivals, every animal delivered needed counting, categorization by type and quality, an attribution to the source that provided it. Tablets record these arrivals with bureaucratic precision. Track storage and status, living animals needed feeding and care while awaiting redistribution. Slaughtered animals needed processing and preservation. The tablets distinguish between animals alive, animals slaughtered, animals in transit. Allocate according to instructions. Temples required specific quantities for sacrifices. Palace households needed meat for rations. Military units required animals for provisions. Administrative texts document allocations with remarkable specificity: 20 sheep to the Temple of Nana, 15 cattle to the Palace of Ur, 30 goats to the garrison at Umma. Account for everything at regular intervals. Administrators conducted audits, reconciling arrivals against departures, living animals against slaughtered animals, expected deliveries against actual deliveries. The tablets preserve these reconciliations. Manage personnel. The operation required butchers, herders, guards, scribes, administrators, and support staff. These personnel received rations, standardized food allocations, tracked in separate administrative texts. The complexity is comparable to modern supply chain management, except instead of computer databases, the system ran on clay tablets, human memory, and bureaucratic procedures refined over generations. Tablet YBC 1672 from Yale documents the career of an official named Abasaga. His name appears across multiple tablets spanning decades, always in contexts related to livestock processing. He wasn't a low-level functionary. He was apparently a senior administrator overseeing aspects of Pusrish Dagon's operation for much of his adult life. Abasaga's career implies institutional continuity. When he entered service, the system was already functioning. When he eventually left service through death or retirement, the tablets don't specify. The system continued. His knowledge, his administrative skills, and his understanding of procedures were passed to successors. This is how institutions persist, through people who embody institutional knowledge, who train their replacements, who maintain practices across time. But Pusrish Dagon itself didn't exist in isolation. It was one node, admittedly a major node, in a larger redistributive network spanning the entire Year 3 state. Other centres handled textile production, metalworking, grain storage, and various crafts. The whole system required coordination. Tablet M 58523 from the Iraq Museum records communication between administrators at Pusrish Dagon and officials at Ur, coordinating livestock deliveries to meet specific palace needs. This coordination required advance notice of requirements so menimals could be prepared, transport arrangements, cinemals could travel from Pusrish Dagon to Ur, timing coordination, animals arrived when needed, not too early or too late. Quality specifications, certain rituals required. Specific animal types, all of which the tablets document happening routinely. The question becomes, how did the Year 3 state develop administrative capacity of this sophistication? The standard answer points to centuries of gradual elaboration. Early city-states developed basic administrative techniques. As political units grew larger through conquest and consolidation, administrative systems scaled up to map. Eventually, during the Year 3 period, the system reached its mature form in institutions like Pusrish Dagon. But there's something striking about the Year 3 administrative corpus. The procedures, vocabularies, and organisational principles appear fully developed in the earliest texts from the period. The system doesn't look experimental, it looks refined, as if the administrators implementing it were working from established templates. This suggests the Year 3 rulers, particularly Shulgi, who founded Pusrish Dagon, were reorganising or reconstituting earlier administrative models rather than inventing new ones. They were rebuilding bureaucracy, not building it for the first time. Evidence for this comes from comparing Year 3 texts with earlier administrative documents from the early dynastic period. The vocabularies overlap significantly. The accounting methods show continuity. The organisational principles reflect common assumptions about how economies should be managed. The Year 3 system wasn't radically innovative. It was elaborated, systematic and efficient, but conceptually it drew on older practices. Pusrish-Dagan processed tens of thousands of animals annually. The tablets document this. But the knowledge required to make the system work, how to manage livestock at scale, how to coordinate deliveries, how to preserve meat, how to allocate resources efficiently, all of that knowledge came from somewhere. It was learned, practiced, transmitted across generations. The tablets are endpoints of that transmission. They record the system operating. They don't explain where the system came from. Tablet MBC 6175 from Yale lists the names of scribes employed at Pusrish-Dagon. 37 names in this particular text. 37 literate, trained administrators working at this single site during one accounting period. Each had to be taught to read and write cuneiform, understand the administrative vocabulary, master the accounting procedures, and work within the institutional hierarchy. Training 37 scribes requires educational infrastructure, schools, teachers, standardized curricula, and time. The Year 3 state maintained this educational system, producing the literate personnel that made complex administration possible. But education requires content to transmit. The scribes learned procedures that predated them. They were being trained in established methods, not inventing methods as they worked. Pusrish-Dagan is fascinating because it's so mundane. It's not a palace, it's not a temple, it's a processing centre. The tablets aren't royal inscriptions or mythological texts, they're inventory, arrivals and departures, numbers. But numbers at this scale track this systematically, manage this efficiently, reflect sophisticated organisational knowledge. The livestock themselves were ephemeral. Living animals became meat, which was consumed, which became energy and waste. The animals are long gone. But the tablets remain, and what they document is memory embedded in institutions, procedures that worked because they'd been refined over time, administrative structures that functioned because they'd been designed, tested, and improved across generations. Pusrish-Dagan is civilization as logistics. It's civilization as counting. It's civilization as the belief that if you track everything carefully enough, if you organize precisely enough, if you coordinate effectively enough, you can manage complexity at scale. And they could. For decades, the system ran. Animals arrived, animals were distributed, the state functioned, the temples received their sacrifices, the palaces fed their households, the system worked, until it didn't. The Year 3 state collapsed around 2000 BC. Political fragmentation, external pressure, internal instability. The details are debated, but collapse is certain. And when the state collapsed, Pusrish-Dagan ceased functioning. The bureaucratic machine stopped. The tablets from the final years show stress. Deliveries become irregular. Allocations don't match projections. The carefully balanced system begins failing. And then silence. The site was abandoned. The redistributive economy collapsed. The administrative apparatus dissolved. But the tablets survived, buried in the ruins, preserved by Mesopotamian dryness, eventually excavated by modern archaeologists and scattered across museum collections worldwide, where they still count, still record, still preserve the memory of a bureaucratic machine that processed civilization through livestock accounting and redistribution. 276 cattle, 1,847 sheep, 94 goats, received, processed, distributed. The system remembers, the mathematics of distance. Let's calculate what Sumerian trade actually required, not theoretically, not abstractly, practically in terms of time, distance, resources and risk. Start with a standard trading expedition to Afghanistan for lapis lazuli. The straight line distance from to Badakhshan is approximately 1,500 miles. But caravans don't travel in straight lines. They follow routes determined by terrain, water sources, and political boundaries. A plausible route might proceed northeast from toward the Zagros Mountains, Nila's 400 miles, through or around mountain passes into the Iranian plateau, mere 300 miles, across the plateau toward modern Mashhad region, mere 500 miles, northeast into Afghan valleys, mere 300 miles, total one-way distance, approximately 5,500 to 1,700 miles of actual travel, round trip 3,400 miles. Donkeys, the primary pack animals, travel roughly 15-20 miles per day under good conditions with loads. But conditions aren't always good. Mountains slow progress. Desert crossings require careful planning around water sources. Weather delays travel. Political negotiations at territorial boundaries take time. A realistic average might be 10-12 miles per day of effective progress once delays are factored in. At 12 miles per day, covering 1,500 miles takes 125 days. That's roughly 4 months one way. Add time at the destination for negotiation, loading and rest, and the round trip approaches 8 to 10 months. Now consider the logistics. Personnel. A caravan large enough to defend itself against raiders might include 10 merchants, traders, 20 guards, armed escorts, 15 drivers, handlers for pack animals, 5 support personnel, etc. Total 50 people. Animals to transport trade goods out and lapis back. 100-150 donkeys for cargo, 50 additional donkeys for water and provisions, total 150-200 animals, provisions for 50 people for 10 months, grain bread, Nagaland 150 kg per person over 300 days, 7.500 kg 7.5 tons. Water needs vary by region but must be resupplied regularly. Animal fodder, donkeys need Nagana 5 kg per day each, 200 animals 5 kg 300 days, Sestat 300 tons must be acquired en route through grazing or purchase. Trade goods. The caravan needs valuable materials to trade for lapis, silver, rimri trade, perhaps 500-1,000 shekels for 8 kg. Textiles, 50-100 high quality garments. Other Mesopotamian products, dates, oil, craft goods, risks, bandit attacks, caravans carried wealth, making them targets. Weather, mountain passes close in winter, desert heat is lethal without. Water, political instability, territories along the route might be hostile or demand tribute. Animal loss, donkeys might die, get injured or be stolen. Disease, personnel might sicken. Navigation errors, getting lost in unfamiliar territory. Even with careful planning, perhaps 10-20% of caravans might fail, losing personnel, animals or trade goods without reaching their destination or returning home. For a single expedition, the capital investment includes purchase of 200 donkeys, provisions and equipment, payment of personnel wages or rations, trade goods to exchange, contingency reserves for bribes, unexpected expenses. Conservatively, this might represent 5,000, 10,000 shekels of silver, equivalent, an enormous sum. The return cargo, if successful, might include 100-200 kg of lapis lazuli, depending on negotiation success. At Mesopotamian prices, high-quality lapis commanded perhaps 20-30 shekels per kilogram, so 150 kg of lapis might be worth 3,000-4,500 shekels, less than the expedition cost. This seems like bad business until you realise the merchant probably doesn't personally finance the whole expedition. It's more likely a palace or temple investment, with the merchant receiving a commission or salary. Or it's a partnership where multiple investors share costs and profits. But even with shared financing, the return on investment is uncertain. The 8-month journey, the significant risks, the massive capital requirement, all for a cargo that might just cover costs if everything goes perfectly. Why did merchants continue making these journeys? Because despite the risks, the trade network functioned. Lapis arrived regularly enough that Mesopotamian craftsmen could plan work around it, which means most expeditions succeeded. That success rate requires several things: route knowledge, detailed understanding of terrain, water sources, seasonal conditions, diplomatic relationships, agreements with intermediary populations to allow passage, security measures, sufficient guards to deter most attacks, logistical expertise, ability to manage supplies, animals and personnel over months, market knowledge, understanding of what goods Afghan populations valued, language skills, ability to communicate across linguistic barriers, cultural competency, understanding of customs and negotiation protocols, all of. This knowledge had to exist before the first successful expedition. You can't learn it during the journey. If you lack crucial knowledge, you fail, and dead merchants don't pass on lessons. Which means the first successful expeditions drew on existing knowledge, possibly knowledge accumulated through shorter journeys that gradually extended range, possibly knowledge inherited from earlier traders. But the knowledge had to pre-exist the expeditions we see documented in tablets. Now multiply this single expedition by all the trade routes simultaneously active. Lapis from Afghanistan 1500, carnelian from the Indus 2000, copper from Oman and 1200 Narded, tin from Afghanistan or Central Asia 500 plus, cedar from Lebanon 650, aromatics from Southern Arabia 1000 pluses. Each route required similar investments in logistics, knowledge and capital. Each faced comparable risks. And somehow, Bronze Age Mesopotamia maintained all of them simultaneously for centuries. The administrative infrastructure to support this required financing mechanisms for expedition, risk management insurance equivalents, partnerships, personnel training Kichi merchants, guards, drivers, diplomatic representation, negotiate passage rights, quality control, ensuring imported materials met standards, accounting investments, returns, profits, legal frameworks, dispute resolution, information systems, market conditions, route safety, all of which existed in the Year 3 period. The tablets documented operating systematically, but this infrastructure took time to develop. Institutions like this aren't invented overnight. They emerge through experience, failure, refinement, and transmission across generations. The tablets show the endpoint. They don't show the developmental process. By the time written records are sophisticated enough to document trade, trade is already sophisticated. There's one more calculation worth making. Knowledge accumulation time. Suppose it takes one generation 25 years to extend trade routes 100 miles further and establish reliable relationships with new intermediary populations. To extend from Mesopotamia to Afghanistan 1,500 miles would require 15 generations, 375 years. This is speculative, of course, but it illustrates that building trade networks of this geographic scope requires multi-generational transmission of knowledge. No single merchant learns all routes. Knowledge accumulates across lifetimes. The merchants we see in Year 3 tablets are inheritors of centuries of accumulated knowledge. They learned routes their fathers travelled, who learned from their fathers before them, extending back generations to times before literacy, before cities, before anyone thought to record journeys on clay tablets. The tablets record numbers, distances travelled, goods exchanged, profits calculated. They don't record the generations of trial, failure, learning and transmission that made those numbers possible. But the numbers remember. They remember that civilization at distance requires calculation, that coordination requires mathematics, that maintaining networks requires counting time, distance, and cost precisely enough to know whether the journey is worth making. 1,500 miles, 200 donkeys, 50 people, 10 months, 150 kilograms of lapis. The numbers are certain. The knowledge that made them possible travels invisibly, carried in merchants' minds, passed from teacher to apprentice, preserved through practice. The tablets count the cost. The merchants remembered the path. What gold could not buy. In the treasuries of Mesopotamian temples, administrative tablets distinguish carefully between types of wealth. Gold, silver, copper, these are listed by weight in standardized units. Grain, oil, dates, these by volume. Textiles by count and quality grade. but certain materials received different treatment, special notation, unusual care in description. Lapis lazuli was one such material. High-quality Afghan lapis didn't just get weighed and recorded. Texts sometimes describe colour depth, clarity, size of pieces. The administrative vocabulary shows attention to quality that suggests the material wasn't entirely fungible. Not all lapis was equivalent. The best pieces had value beyond weight. Tin was similar. Administrative texts specified tin purity, distinguishing refined metal from ore, noting quality grades. For bronze production, purity mattered enormously. Impure tin ruined alloy ratios and produced inferior bronze. Quality control was essential. Cedar, too, received special attention. Texts distinguished between beam lengths, timber quality, freedom from knots or defects. For temple construction, inferior cedar wasn't acceptable. The gods required the best. What all these materials share is irreplaceability. They couldn't be substituted. If you needed lapis lazuli for a royal seal or divine statue, no other bluestone would do. Egyptian blue existed, but it wasn't lapis. Azurite is blue, but it's not lapis. Only genuine Afghan lapis had the deep celestial blue with gold pyrite flecks that Mesopotamian culture associated with divinity. If you needed tin to bronze copper, no other material worked. Lead creates different alloys. Arsenic creates arsenical bronze, but it's toxic to work with and has different properties. For true bronze, the material that defined the age, you needed tin. If you needed cedar for temple beams, local date palm wood couldn't substitute. Palm wood splits, rots, and can't span the distances required for large structures. For permanent architecture, cedar was irreplaceable. This irreplaceability created dependency. Mesopotamian civilization's advancement required continuous access to materials it couldn't produce. The dependency wasn't optional, it was structural. Contrast this with gold. Gold was valuable, prestigious, desired for royal and divine contexts. But if gold became unavailable, life continued. Temple rituals adapted. Jewelers used silver instead. Prestige found other expressions. Gold was important, but not essential. Tin was essential. Without tin, bronze production stopped. Without bronze, tools dulled, weapons weakened, and technological parity with neighbours disappeared. Losing tin access meant regression to copper or stone tool technology while enemies wielded bronze. That was existential threat. Similarly, cedar loss meant monumental construction halted. Temples couldn't be built or repaired at necessary scales. Architectural ambition contracted. The civilization's physical expression diminished. Lapis loss might seem less critical, it's decorative, not functional. But in a theocratic society where divine statues required lapis eyes and temple decorations employed lapis inlay, losing access meant inability to properly honour the gods. In that cultural context, that was serious. The irreplaceable materials weren't luxuries, they were necessities for maintaining civilization at its developed level. This distinction matters enormously. It means maintaining trade networks wasn't economically optional, it was civilizationally mandatory. Whatever the cost, whatever the difficulty, access to these materials had to be preserved. The tablets document this imperative through their consistency. Century after century, lapis arrives, tin arrives, copper arrives, cedar arrives. The supply chains persist despite political changes, despite warfare, despite economic disruption. They persist because they must. This dependency raises a question: how did it arise? One model suggests gradual adoption. Early Mesopotamian cultures used local materials. As craftsmanship improved and ambitions expanded, artisans experimented with exotic materials obtained through expanding trade. Eventually, these materials became so central to cultural expression that they became irreplaceable. This model treats dependency as a consequence of cultural development. The civilization grew into dependency by developing tastes and practices that required distant materials. But there's another model. What if the dependency was inherited? What if Sumerian civilization from its inception was designed around materials from distant sources? What if the trade networks were foundational rather than elaborated? The evidence leans toward the second model. The earliest Sumerian cities show exotic materials. Early dynastic graves contain lapis, early temples used cedar. The irreplaceable materials appear at the beginning, not as later additions, which suggests Sumerian civilization was conceptualized from the start as part of a larger network. Building cities in resource-poor southern Mesopotamia only made sense if access to distant materials was assured. Otherwise, why build there? Why not build in regions with stone, timber, and metal nearby? The answer might be agricultural productivity. Mesopotamian alluvial soil produced extraordinary grain yields. That productivity supported dense populations. Dense populations enabled specialization, craft production, and the development of civilization's complexity. But this only works if agricultural surplus can be exchanged for necessary materials. The system requires trade networks to function from the beginning. So Sumerian civilization wasn't self-sufficient civilization that later developed trade. It was network-dependent civilization from inception. The cities made sense only as nodes in a larger network. Isolate them, cut the trade routes, and they become unsustainable. Tablet YBC 2177 from Yale, dating to the Ur III period, lists the annual requirements for a major temple complex. The list includes lapis lazuli for divine statues and inlay, multiple kilograms annually, cedar for construction and repair, dozens of large beams, tin and copper for bronze ritual implements, hundreds of kilograms, aromatics for incense, substantial quantities of frankincense and myrrh, carnelian and other stones for jewellery and decoration. None of these materials were local. Every item required imports. The temple's operation depended on functioning trade networks. Disrupt those networks, and the temple couldn't fulfill its religious functions. Scale that dependency across all temples in a city, add palace requirements, add private demand, and you realise entire urban populations depended on materials from hundreds or thousands of miles away. This is why trade networks persisted. This is why merchants made dangerous journeys. This is why states invested in diplomatic relationships with distant partners. Not for profit, though profit mattered, but for survival, for civilizational continuity. The tablets record success. They record arrivals. They document the system working. What they don't record are the alternatives that weren't chosen. Why not relocate cities to regions with more resources? Why not develop substitutes for essential materials? Why not redesign civilization to be less dependent on distant supply chains? These questions probably didn't arise. The dependency was assumed. It was foundational. It was how civilization worked. But assumptions have origins. At some point, someone had to decide that building in southern Mesopotamia made sense despite resource poverty. Someone had to know that trade networks could supply what the land lacked. Someone had to trust that distant sources would remain accessible. That decision, that knowledge, that trust predated the tablets. By the time written records begin, the decision is already made, the network already functions, and the dependency is established. Gold could be foregone, beauty finds other expressions, prestige adapts, but tin, cedar, lapis, these couldn't be replaced, and civilization arranged itself around that fact. Cities rose in fertile mud, dependent on distant mountains, trusting that stone, metal and aromatic wood would flow from unseen sources to hands that shaped them into temples, tools and monuments. The tablets counted arrivals. They didn't question why anyone believed the arrivals would continue, but they did, for centuries, until they didn't. Until the networks fractured, the supply chains broke, and civilizations collapsed into dark ages where once common materials became legendary. And then, eventually, the networks were rebuilt. Knowledge was recovered. Trade resumed. New cities rose. As if civilization remembered how it was supposed to work. as if the pattern was older than any particular city, older than any particular dynasty, as if the networks themselves had memory, encoded in roots, in materials, in the knowledge of what connects to what, and where the bluestone sleeps, and how cedar smells when it first sees fire. The tablets preserve the dependency, the materials remember the connections, and the question remains, who taught them it should be this way? The memory in things. That bead from the British Museum vault, catalogue number 1929,1077.146. We return to where we began, a small object weighing 2 grams, lapis lazuli body with carnelian spacers and gold caps, recovered from Ur in the winter of 1927 by Leonard Woolley's excavation team. It lay in the earth for 46 centuries before human hands touched it again. 46 centuries. During that time, empires rose and collapsed. Languages died and were born. Cities flourished and crumbled. The very knowledge of how to read cuneiform was lost, then painstakingly recovered by modern scholars. The world the bead was made for vanished so thoroughly that when Woolley found it, he was excavating what seemed like alien civilization. But the bead itself survived. The lapis is still blue, the gold still gleams. The materials remember nothing because they're not conscious, but they preserve everything because they're essentially eternal. The lapis began in Afghan mountains. Someone extracted it from the earth. Someone transported it across 1,500 miles. Someone in Ur received it. A craftsman cut it, drilled it, shaped it. Another craftsman combined it with carnelian from the Indus and gold from northern sources. Someone designed the necklace. Someone wore it. Someone was buried with it. And 46 centuries later, someone catalogued it. Each step in that chain required knowledge. The miner knew where to find the stone. The merchant knew the route to transport it. The craftsman knew how to work it. The designer knew how to combine materials aesthetically. And beneath all these individual knowledge instances was larger knowledge, that this network of materials, sources, and techniques existed and functioned. The tablets document parts of this knowledge network. They record arrivals, transactions, allocations, but they don't record the deepest knowledge, the knowledge that the network itself should exist. Throughout this investigation, we've encountered a pattern. Whenever written records become sophisticated enough to document some aspect of Sumerian civilization, that aspect appears already mature. Trade networks are established. Craft techniques are refined. Administrative procedures are systematic. Professional classes exist. Standards are set. There's no visible developmental phase in the written record. No evidence of experimentation, failure, and gradual improvement. By the time literacy captures anything, it's already working. This pattern suggests one of two things. Either development happened in a preliterate phase, and writing only began once systems were already sophisticated, or the Sumerians were reconstituting systems from earlier templates, rebuilding rather than building new. Both possibilities point toward knowledge transmission across time through non-written means, either oral tradition, embodied practice, apprenticeship, and cultural memory preserve knowledge during preliterate periods, or they preserve knowledge through civilizational disruption and rebuilding. The bead connects these possibilities. It's a physical object that embodies knowledge of distant sources, intercultural trade, craft technique, and aesthetic tradition. It needed all those knowledge systems to exist, and it survives as testimony that those systems functioned. The Sumerian texts we've examined treat their trade networks, their knowledge of distant materials, their administrative competencies as given facts. They don't explain origins, they describe operations. They're user manuals for a system whose foundational architecture is assumed. This assumption might reflect that the Sumerians understood their civilization as restoration rather than innovation. The myths we've touched on, Dilmun's paradise, divine descent of civilization, knowledge given by the gods, These could be cultural memories of earlier systems being rebuilt, or they could be mythologization of gradual development. Humans tend to project origins back to foundational moments, to explain complexity through simplifying narratives of divine or ancestral wisdom. We can't know with certainty. The tablets don't address ultimate origins because that wasn't their purpose. They documented operations, not philosophies. But we can observe what they do preserve: evidence of networks that connected worlds, knowledge that spanned distances, materials that travelled thousands of miles, and administrative competence that managed it all routinely. Behind every tablet listing Lapis arrivals is a chain of human decisions, relationships, and knowledge extending backward through time and outward through space. The tablet is the endpoint. The network is the achievement, and the network functioned because knowledge preserved it. Merchants remembered routes, craftsmen remembered techniques, administrators remembered procedures, teachers taught students, fathers taught sons. Knowledge flowed from generation to generation, maintaining continuity even as individual lives ended. This is how civilizations persist. Not through monuments, though those matter. Not through written texts, though those preserve much. Through knowledge transmitted in practice, in doing, in teaching, in participating in systems larger than individual lives. The bead carries this kind of memory. Not conscious memory, but material testimony. It exists because multiple knowledge systems function simultaneously across vast spaces. It survives as proof of connections that predated writing and might predate the cities themselves. Throughout human history, trade goods have been vectors of cultural exchange. Materials travel, and with them travel ideas, techniques, aesthetics, and relationships. The lapis trade wasn't just stone moving. It was Afghan miners connecting to Iranian merchants, connecting to Mesopotamian craftsmen, connecting to Sumerian consumers. Each connection required understanding, communication, and trust. These connection networks, once established, become infrastructure. Later generations inherit them, maintain them, and often forget how they began. They become part of the assumed world, the way things are. The Sumerian tablets show networks in operation, but not in formation. We see the inheritance, not the original construction. This gap is where questions live. What if the trade networks that Bronze Age Mesopotamia depended on weren't Bronze Age innovations? What if they were older? What if the reason they appear fully formed in early texts is that they were being renewed rather than invented? What if the blue stone trade is ancient beyond writing? What if merchants carrying lapis from Afghanistan to Mesopotamia 4,000 years ago were following routes older than Sumerian cities? What if the knowledge of where the blue stone sleeps predates the civilizations that finally wrote that knowledge down? We can't prove this from tablets alone, but we can notice the pattern. We can observe that every time writing becomes sophisticated enough to document something, that something is already sophisticated. We can recognize that knowledge systems substantial enough to generate what we see in the tablets required time to develop. And we can ask whether that development time fits within the periods conventionally assigned, or whether it suggests earlier origins. The bead doesn't answer these questions. It simply exists. Blue stone from Afghanistan, orange stone from India, yellow metal from northern mountains, combined in by hands-long dust, buried with someone whose name might appear on a tablet somewhere if we could read all the tablets, if they all survived, if we knew what we were looking for. The necklace that bead came from might have been beautiful, probably was. Carnelian and lapis alternate in patterns, red, orange and deep blue, warm and cool, earth and sky. The gold caps catch light. The whole piece glows with quiet radiance. Someone designed that, made aesthetic decisions, chose those materials for those effects, and had confidence that those materials could be obtained, that sources half a world away would deliver the stones to make beauty. That confidence is the deepest mystery. Not just practical knowledge of trade routes, but cultural confidence that the world was connected, that distant things could be brought together, that materials from Afghanistan and India could meet in Mesopotamia and combine into jewellery for a Sumerian noble. Where does such confidence come from? Not from a single successful expedition, from sustained reliability over time, from inherited trust that the networks function because they've always functioned. The tablets document the functioning, they count arrivals, they allocate materials, they track transactions, but behind the counting is memory. Memory of roots, of relationships, of knowledge accumulated across generations. Memory that didn't need writing because it lived in practice, in the doing, in merchants who knew the path, and craftsmen who knew the stone. And now, 46 centuries later, the bead sits in a museum vault under artificial light. Archaeologists studied it, conservators stabilised it, curators catalogued it, researchers photographed it, and somewhere in digital databases its measurements, material composition and archaeological context are recorded. Modern tablets for a modern network. The bead connects past to present, not just chronologically but conceptually. It embodies the same principle that animated its creation. Distant things can be brought together through knowledge, effort, and the maintenance of networks across space and time. You, reading this, wherever you are part of a network vastly larger than anything the Sumerians knew. Materials in your life come from across the globe. Technologies you use embody knowledge from countless sources. You participate in systems you didn't create and mostly don't understand. So did the Sumerians. They inherited networks, maintained them, and passed them forward. The tablets are part of that transmission, written memories of how the networks operated, preserved so later generations might understand, or at least might continue the practice. The bead has no voice. It makes no claims. It simply is. But in its being, in its combination of materials from disparate sources, in its testimony to craft knowledge and aesthetic choice, in its survival across vast time, it remembers. It remembers that worlds connect. That knowledge travels, that distant things can be brought together if someone knows the way, someone remembers the technique, someone maintains the relationships that make distant materials accessible. The tablets counted arrivals, the merchants remembered routes, the craftsmen remembered techniques, and the bead, silent witness, remembers that memory is possible, that knowledge can be preserved, that networks endure, that what connects can remain connected if someone, somewhere, generation after generation, maintains the thread. The Sumerian texts reveal the rarest commodities in Sumer, not gold, not grain, not silver, though these had value. The rarest commodity was knowledge. Knowledge of where things were, how to get them, how to work them, how to organise their acquisition at civilizational scale. That knowledge, transmitted across generations, maintained through practice and teaching and lived experience, was what made everything else possible. The tablets preserve fragments, the materials carry testimony, and the question remains, unanswered but ever present. Who taught them first? How did they know? And what memories, older than cities, older than writing, older than the civilizations we can document, carried forward in practice until finally someone thought to press stylus to clay and count. The bead is silent, the tablets count, and the networks remember, across time and distance, that knowledge is the wealth that makes all other wealth possible. The knowledge of connection, the memory that things distant can be brought together. And perhaps that knowledge itself is older than we imagine, older than Sumer, carried forward through disruption and rebuilding, loss and recovery, until we find it preserved in administrative tablets that record arrivals without explaining how anyone knew what should arrive. The bead weighs 2 grams. The knowledge weighs worlds. And if any of this resonates with you, If these patterns intrigue you, if the questions feel worth asking, then the transmission continues. Knowledge travelling across time, connections maintained. From ancient merchants to modern listeners, the thread endures. The networks remember. The blue stone still sleeps in Afghan mountains, and somewhere someone knows the way.